Hello and welcome to Take Control of Your Liberty with Scott Tregurtha, where we help critical thinkers by giving you the most true and accurate information we can find, which they should be giving you on mainstream media, but are not. So you can decide for yourself and take control of your liberty, your freedom, and your future. And now, here is Scott Tregurtha.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to my show today. As a nation, I think we need to confront some evil here. And that evil has been around for a very long time. And for whatever reasons, this evil wants to control the population of this planet and bend them to its will. This evil entity is willing to cause any amount of deaths, as they have no regard for human life, as they constantly demonstrate by creating never-ending wars, which kill millions, and have been responsible for assassinating several of our presidents and anyone who gets in their way. And now we have a man named Donald Trump, who stood against them on our behalf during his first term as president, is still standing against them, and wants another term so he can really put the final nail in this evil empire's coffin. And these bad guys know it, and cannot have that if they are to survive any longer. They have, through the Democrats, RINOs, and various other pawns, impeached him twice, stole the 2020 election from him, and we the people, indicted him 4 times, smeared him in the media, and yet his poll numbers keep climbing to the point that these criminal scumbags won't be able to commit enough fraud to prevent him from winning the next election, which is a fate worse than death for these guys. So what else is left for these criminals to do? The answer is what they or their predecessors did to Lincoln, McKinley, JFK, and anyone else that tried to get in their way, and that would be to assassinate him. My next guest is going to explain to you who would do this, and who has done this in the past. His name is Bob Ingram. He has been a political activist for 48 years, is an author, and has investigated the enemies of our country in depth, as well as conducted intense research on who assassinated those 3 presidents, and they are of the same entity which has an intense need to prevent another Trump presidency. So please join me now with my guest, Bob Ingram. Hi, Bob. Glad to have you here.
I'm very glad to be here, Scott.
Great. So the reason we're doing this interview is you wrote a dossier entitled A Police Dossier. It is the British Who Murder Our Presidents. And this kind of, what you put in there is getting to be more and more important for people to actually know what's going on. So we want to part the information to them and actually have them spread this around. So to begin with, could you please just give a brief synopsis of the dossier, and then we can go from there?
Sure. I'll just introduce it by saying that I'm sure all of your listeners are well aware and have followed very closely the unprecedented police state operations against Donald Trump, which began even before his election in 2016, and including spying on his campaign, then the Russiagate investigations and allegations, the 2 impeachment proceedings against him, the theft of the 2020 election, and now obviously all of the legal indictments around the country, as well as the efforts to take him off the ballot in a number of states. Up until now, outside of the theft of the election, everything that has been thrown against Trump has failed. And what we have witnessed is his growing support in the population. He's going from strength to strength. And as Tucker Carlson put it on one of his shows a couple of weeks ago, with Russiagate failing, with impeachments failing, with court cases failing, with efforts to exclude him from the ballot failing, with everything they've thrown against him having failed and resulted in him just becoming more and more popular, what is the only option left for the oligarchy to prevent Trump from coming back into the White House in 2025? And Carlson says, well, the only option left is to assassinate him. And that is something which I mean, we cannot predict the future, but this threat to Trump's life is, I think, something which people should take very, very seriously. Now, the topic of this report, which was just published by LaRouche, the police dossier, there's 5 parts to the report. One section written by Barbara Boyd deals with the question of Trump and the attacks on Trump and the threat to Trump and where it's all coming from. The 3 of the other sections deal with the British assassination of 3 different American presidents throughout our history. The first being Abraham Lincoln, the second being William McKinley, and the third being John F. Kennedy. What is, I believe, demonstrated conclusively in those 3 reports, what's demonstrated is that it was the British Empire which killed all 3 of these presidents. Now, that's obviously not something you're going to read in the history books when you go to school, or that's going to be presented to you by the establishment media. You're certainly not going to read it on Wikipedia or one of these other idiotic websites. But the evidence is clear and the evidence is overwhelming. And it's not just a question of making these allegations. The evidence has gone through in these 3 reports on McKinley, Lincoln, and Kennedy. And people can read it and download it from the LaRouche website. The final part of the dossier, which is actually the introduction to the dossier, the first part, is to sort of challenge people on this question of the British Empire, because we suffer from 2 delusions within our culture, which has sort of been hammered into us over a period of decades now. One is that Great Britain is our closest ally, our British cousins, our friends. We share a common language, et cetera, et cetera. And how can you say anything bad about Great Britain? And the second delusion is that the British Empire doesn't exist anymore, that Great Britain is now just sort of a has-been nation, a little island, and that it really doesn't play a major role in the world, which is completely untrue. And this has gone through in the report, from the standpoint that what very few people actually know is that the British Empire, going all the way back into the 18th century, was and remains today primarily a financial empire, a control over global finance, banking, and these kind of things. And that power residing in the city of London is still very dominant and very real today. So it's impossible in this sort of short time frame to go into all of the aspects of the report, all of the details of the report. I would encourage everyone who is watching this to go to the LaRouche website, download it, read it, and circulate it. Because clearly, I think as everyone recognizes, the weeks and the months ahead of us as we move into the primary season and then into the November election is going to be a very wild time. It is important for people to recognize what this fight is really all about. And I'll just say one other thing and then turn it back over to you, which is that as we are speaking here right now, today, the World Economic Forum is going on in Davos, Switzerland. We're right in the middle of it. It ends tomorrow, I think. There's actually an article on this Davos conference, which is just being posted as we speak on the LaRouche PAC website, so people can read that too. But this is a gathering of oligarchs. That's what it is. This is Klaus Schwab's organization, but top people from the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, Wall Street banks, London banks, hedge funds, private wealth funds, the World Health Organization, they're all gathered there. And it is very clear that they are very freaked out, that their system of globalization, which has sort of ruled the roost for the last 20 years, is now coming apart. It's now beginning to disintegrate. And what they are all freaked out about, very freaked out about, is the prospect of Donald Trump coming back into the White House. And leading into that conference, two of these spokesmen or agents of this oligarchy gave interviews in which they were very explicit about this. One was an interview given by Christine Lagarde to French television on January 11th, just a few days ago. Now, for those who don't know, Christine Lagarde is currently the president of the European Central Bank, and she is formerly the director of the International Monetary Fund. And in that interview, she stated that if Trump were to become president again for a second term, that this would be a clear threat, and she used that word, a clear threat to Europe, to the central banking system, and basically to the interests that she represents. Now, the second interview was given by a man named Richard Dearlove to Sky News on January 14th. And for those who are not familiar with him, Richard Dearlove is the former head of MI6, which is British secret intelligence, and he's the former head of it. And in that interview with Sky News, Dearlove stated that if Trump were to come back into the White House, that this would cause an enormous problem for Britain, for NATO. He said this is a big deal, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's from the head of British intelligence, or the former head of British intelligence. And Dearlove is not just someone saying this. It was Dearlove who played a major role in all of the Russiagate allegations against Donald Trump, supplying material to Brennan at the CIA, supplying material to Robert Mueller's investigation. The whole Russiagate operation against Trump was created in Britain and run through British intelligence into Washington, D.C. And now he is saying we cannot allow Donald Trump to serve a second term. So these are very dangerous times, and people have to recognize who the enemy of this country really is. There are countries we have differences with. There are countries that we have problems with, that we have to work things out. Tough negotiations with countries like North Korea or China or other countries. This is what Trump has talked about this a lot. But you sit down and you talk. North Korea is not our enemy. China is not our enemy. We may have serious problems with China. That's what negotiations are for. The British Empire is the enemy of the United States and always has been since 1776. This is what this report is all about, both to try to educate people as to this question of the British Empire, and then to identify the threat to Trump and document the assassination of these three former American presidents. So that's what I would sort of say to start off with.
Okay, great. And if anyone doubts that it's the British Empire, because people have a tendency to do that because they think that was something happened back during our revolution. You go into it pretty well in the dossier, showing the roles they played in Lincoln's assassination and the roles they played in backing the South, and how we were it was actually a proxy war between England, Great Britain, and the U.S. Via the South U.S., just like the Ukraine is being used as a proxy war between the British again with Russia. And another thing is, you just mentioned how these certain countries are not our enemies, like Russia, China, North Korea, so on. And Trump was very strong in dealing with them, but he dealt with them and he negotiated with them in a way that worked out best for everybody. And he would have continued. And this is one thing the British couldn't stand. Now, with all that said, and you did mention there are some obvious things like Dear Love, and Christopher Steele was the author of the Steele dossier, which was used big time in the Russiagate situation.
Yeah, it was the basis of the Russiagate operation.
It was actually the basis of it. So there are some key players right there. But in general, though, and we really want to get people focused on who the enemy really is, because how can you attack them or defend against them if you don't know who it is? Now, a lot of people are way more aware now that we've got a globalist empire in general. They think of BlackRock and so on, right? How much more can we tie so people can understand this, the role the British are playing in all this? And in fact, they're playing a role in making some of these countries our enemies, like China and Russia and so on. How does that benefit them? And how do we know they are the actual enemy?
Well, a lot of people have a problem wrapping their heads around this question of an oligarchy or an empire. People tend to think that, well, it's just what you've got is some rich people who want to make a lot of money so that they can buy super yachts and live on vacation islands somewhere. And that all exists. That's all true. But you have to begin to really investigate. You have to use your mind. You have to begin to investigate and look into how the world has been run over the last 250 years, right on down to the present day. Yeah, I mean, for instance, you take the Civil War, you mentioned it. This may shock some people, but there was no such thing really as a civil war in the United States. I mean, that is a term that was applied to it later, which really is extremely misleading because it was a proxy war. Just as NATO is using the Ukraine right now to attack Russia and supplying the Ukraine with money, with weapons, with ammunition, with everything it needs to wage the war. Well, that's what happened between 1861 and 1865 in the United States, when the South, the Confederacy, was used by the British Empire to try to dismember and destroy the United States. And that's not just some allegation I'm making. I mean, the evidence, the record is extremely clear. All of the weapons, all of the ammunition that was used by the Confederate Army was shipped over from England, all of it. The British shipped over 400,000 rifles to the Confederate Army. They shipped over all of the ammunition. When Grant took Petersburg, it was either Petersburg or Richmond towards the end of the war, and they went to the arsenals, all of the ammunition was packed in boxes shipped from Liverpool. The Confederate Navy, the warships, the blockade runners were built in Liverpool and British shipyards. Even the food that the Confederate soldiers ate was being shipped over from England. I mean, it's just like Zelensky today. Zelensky comes to Washington, begs for support. We send him money, ammunition, weapons, whatever he needs. And that is exactly what the British did in the Civil War. The British have been the enemy of the United States from the very beginning. And it was only the assassination of William McKinley and the bringing in of Teddy Roosevelt where that began to change. One of the problems people can't really figure out is to distinguish between the nation of Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Scotland and Northern Ireland or whatever, between the nation of Great Britain and what I mean by the British Empire. The nation of Great Britain is sort of somewhat of a third-rate country at this point, but that's not the British Empire. In the 19th century and the early 20th century, the British established something called a global central banking system. This is a system of privately owned, outside of the control of government, privately owned central banks run by financiers who control the world monetary and banking system. They control it. The Federal Reserve is part of this, but the Federal Reserve is only one of many central banks. The central banking system was created by London and spread all over the world. Then in the 1960s, 1970s, and 80s, you had the creation of what's today called the offshore banking system or the offshore financial institutions. These now have trillions of dollars in deposits, trillions of dollars in deposits, all hidden, all untraceable. The old Swiss banking laws, outside of the control of any sovereign government. And this is where the money flows through the offshore banks for global drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking, massive criminal and corrupt activity. It's a financial empire. And this is the modern British Empire. And when you look at a conference like Davos, people get sort of worked up about Klaus Schwab. He's just a cartoon figure. He's like something out of Austin Powers, or something. Look at who attends these conferences. Like you said, people like BlackRock and others. It's all top financiers, top spooks, major players in this oligarchical elite. And they are out right now to destroy national sovereignty, to impose totalitarian censorship on every nation in the world, to destroy free speech. And of course, I think is obvious to everyone, they are totally committed to the whole climate change apparatus of the top conferences to reduce carbon emissions and to essentially reduce the world's population. This is an imperial elite. Yeah, again, people have a problem in dealing with evil, with oligarchy. Evil, people say, well, they see it in religious terms. Okay, that's fine. But there is organized evil in the world. The culture, the viewpoint of the oligarchy is that all human beings are animals. We're all governed by our passions, greed, lust, etc. But they're the alpha dogs, that they are the ones, their class, who are born to rule over everyone else. And that's what this is really all about. This imperial outlook, oligarchical outlook, has been the enemy of the United States since our founding, and they have been determined to eradicate the founding principles of the United States, to wipe them out off the face of the earth. The principles of the Declaration of Independence, the principles of the Constitution, get rid of them, throw them in the trash can. So, this is the kind of situation we're dealing with. So anyway, back to you.
Yeah, sure. And you're absolutely correct. It is. And and people do need to do their own research. They're just not going to sit here and watch this and read your dossier and just necessarily know for a fact that all this is true. They may need to do some research. And most of us have, because we care enough about what's going on. If you look at the world, it's been under some sort of suppressive rule or attempt at suppressive rule since forever. right? So people are going to have to do their own research, and I think more and more people are, because it's kind of a necessity level. Things just are getting more and more grim. But back to the British Empire concept, what exactly makes this a British empire as opposed to just a general global financial empire?
If you go back to say, the 16th century, the 1500s, when you had a number of these maritime empires, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire, and they all were establishing colonies and what have you. But beginning in 1688, and then sort of culminating with the victory of the British in the 7 Years' War, that was in 1763, the British Empire essentially defeated all of their rivals. I mean, they continued to exist. Spanish Empire continued and the others. But by 1763, Britain was the dominant power, the dominant global imperial power. It had defeated all of its rivals, and it had created an empire. You know, as they say, the sun never sets on the British Empire. They created an empire which circled the earth, India, everywhere, you know, Australia, Africa, North America. Now, it's more than just a military defeat of their rivals or the geographical extent of their empire. Because what happened in 1688, and what, you know, historians call the Glorious Revolution, is that the British king was overthrown, James II, and William and Mary came in from the Netherlands and took the British throne. Now, what this did is that this created, Lyndon LaRouche would call, the Anglo-Dutch imperial system, because Amsterdam in the Netherlands had become the center of a new form of financial empire, with the creation of the Bank of Amsterdam, the creation of the stock exchange, the Bourse, the Dutch East India Company. They created a banking and financial colossus, which essentially took over the Dutch state, or you could say they were merged. The state, the institutions of the state, the government, became subverted to the point where, rather than serving the people of Holland, the state existed only to serve the interests of this new financial oligarchy. Now, what happened, and that was in Amsterdam in the 17th century. What happened with the Glorious Revolution is that this Dutch system was then brought into London. And you got the creation of the Bank of England, the London Stock Exchange, and the British East India Company, which had existed earlier, but it was completely reorganized after the Dutch came in. And London became the center of this enormous financial and banking sort of Goliath. And this became the British Empire. The Bank of England, the related institutions, everything in England came under the control of this imperial financial system. And the British Navy and the British military were essentially deployed in the interests of this imperial system. And this is basically what we revolted against in 1775. This is what we revolted against. And then as you move into the 19th century, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there was no rival to the British Empire anywhere in the world. I mean, other nations had certain spheres of influence, spheres of power, But in terms of global dominance, the British Empire was supreme. And some people who've studied history can see this in terms of the British colonies, the British fleet, all the wars that they fought during the 19th century. What people don't see is the way in which the British financial system grew to dominate every nation in the world. I mean, after the Napoleonic Wars, the British created the British gold standard. And you have some people today, very foolish, who think this British gold standard was a good thing. It was never a good thing. But they created this British gold standard, which was controlled in London, and every nation was forced to obey a rules-based system, as they say. Every nation was forced to obey the rules of the British gold standard. And this is what Abraham Lincoln revolted against. When 1862, I believe it was, or in the middle of the Civil War, 62 or 63, Lincoln issued the greenbacks, which violated the rules of the British gold standard, because Lincoln said these are not backed by gold, but we declare them to be legal money, legal tender, backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, and these are going to be circulated on a par with gold. This was sort of a declaration of independence by Lincoln from the British gold standard. I mean, this is what they're out to protect. I mean, look at what happened in 2008 with the Wall Street crisis and crash and Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers and all of that. What was the first thing that happened? Is the government moved in to bail these institutions out. These imperial financial systems are the real power brokers and must be protected at all costs. At least that's their view. Any threat to that global power, the British have always met with deadly force, because, again, it is their view that they are born to rule. I mean, they don't really care what happens to the island of Great Britain.
Right.
Because that's not where their power lies, not anymore. Today, whether it's the war in the Ukraine or the attacks against the Houthis in the Red Sea, you always see in every one of these military conflicts, you go back to what was done in Yugoslavia when Bill Clinton was president, you always see in these military conflicts that it is the United States and Britain leading these military conflicts. So the British have been successful in manipulating the United States into military adventures which they deem to be in the interests of the British Empire. We sort of become their force that they've been able to deploy, since they no longer really are a strategic military power. They use our power. But they're not a has-been. The British Empire is not something from the history books. You have to look at how the world operates today. Who really pulls the strings on global policy today? Start tracing this up towards the top.
Right. Very good. Now, it's pretty clear to at least me and people who've been studying this that the British want to use the United States to go after other countries, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And they're using the United States, like, for example, right now to use the Ukraine to go after Russia.
Right.
And at the same time, the British want to destroy Russia, right? And they want to destroy the United States also, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, they are stupid enough where they don't even realize they're going to do their own selves in sooner or later, right? But what is their, at least not pretended, but their seeming purpose for wanting to destroy the United States if they need them to go after these other countries?
I mean, this has been the whole overall perspective of the British since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The perspective has been to eliminate almost completely national sovereignty, because the role of sovereign government, actual sovereign government, is that the government of a particular nation is obligated to defend the interests of the people of their own nation, to build up the economy, to build schools, to build hospitals, to develop industry and science, that the government is going to protect and defend, as it says in our Constitution, the general welfare of the people of the nation. Well, sovereignty is an obstacle to imperial rule. And the idea has been step by step by step to eliminate sovereignty and to increasingly impose transnational or global policies and ideologies which will strengthen the imperial financial system and which will perpetuate their rule. I mean, these are the people who created the whole green agenda, decarbonization, the net zero, to essentially deindustrialize nation after nation after nation. I mean, anyone who thinks that you're going to have an advanced industrial economy, a progressive industrial economy, which is going to provide decent living standards and opportunities for 7 or 8 billion people in the world, as however many there are right now, that you're going to have that kind of a technologically progressive, growing, productive economy. Anyone who thinks you can do that with wind power, solar power, and batteries needs their head examined. Right. Only an idiot would believe that. Yet, what does the mass media do? What does the United Nations do? What does the World Economic Forum do? They repeat over and over and over and over and over again that we must go into this green future. We must shut down fossil fuels, nuclear power, everything else, just have windmills and solar panels. This is a recipe for mass genocide, mass depopulation, and the destruction of every productive economy in the world. Now, you ask yourself, why would the British Empire do that? Who benefits from that? Well, they benefit from it because they're not interested in human progress. And in fact, human progress is a threat to them. If nations become strong and productive and sovereign, this is a threat to imperial rule. But if nations become weak and impoverished, what are you left with? You're left with a world run by this imperial financial system. And with the military force of NATO and what have you to go in and enforce these policies on any country that resists. That's essentially what they're doing. Now, I would say, because I don't want to make this doom and gloom, because it's certainly not. If you look at the political situation right now, the opportunity to get Donald Trump back in the White House is very real, and the likelihood of it is growing every day. But also, if you look, for instance, at this World Economic Forum conference going on right now, they're all freaked out, and they're freaked out about Trump, but they're also freaked out that the globalist system that they have tried to build over the last 30 years since the downfall of the Berlin Wall, that this globalist system is beginning to fall apart, that more and more nations are beginning to reassert their sovereignty, that nations are not going along with these policies, that they're not willing to commit suicide. So, for instance, at this conference, there were a number of speakers in Davos who said, nobody's obeying the climate accords. Countries just keep building coal plants and fossil fuel plants, and they're not going to meet their targets to reduce carbon emissions. And countries are doing this and countries are doing that. And they're all freaked out that many nations around the world are now in revolt and are now acting in ways to defend their own interests. And of course, the globalists, the imperialists, to them, this is a threat, but it's a threat to their system, is what it is. What LaRouche always talked about, because you have a lot of talk now about this, that, and the other thing, BRICS and this and that. I mean, some of that is good, some of it is not very important. The thing that Lyndon LaRouche always stressed, which I think is also the outlook of Donald Trump, is that what you want in the world is an alliance, or if not an alliance, cooperation among perfectly sovereign nations. No international agency, whether it's the IMF, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, or anything else, NATO, no organization is empowered to override or dictate policy to a sovereign nation. And the way the world should be run and could be run is through agreements among sovereign nations. Now, that's the opposite of the British Empire's idea of a rules-based order in which you have rules, but the rules don't stem from any country or nation. The rules are dictated by these globalist institutions, which have been created to dictate policy to nations, to countries. Their system is falling apart. We're in a crisis. They're very dangerous. I mean, they're very freaked out. And that was very clear from monitoring these speeches at Davos. But because of this, they're also extraordinarily dangerous. They say a wounded animal is the most dangerous animal, and which is what makes the threat to Trump so real. And people should take it very seriously. So go ahead.
Sure. And that was a very good explanation of what's going on, I believe. And it occurs to me while you were saying that is, of course, the sovereignty of nations is what Trump is after here. When he says make America great again, he's really saying make America sovereign again. And he says also you should be making Hungary great again, and you should be making Spain great. If that's your country, you should be making that country great again, which means you should be making that country sovereign.
Yeah.
And we will all work together, as he did when he was in there. He might have done it with an iron fist, but he worked things out with Russia, China, North Korea, and he brokered that peace deal in the Middle East, right?
Yeah, the Abrams Accord.
The Abrams Accord, correct. And this is what he's after, and that blows their whole deal.
Yeah. In fact, if people can Google it. I don't remember the exact year. It was while he was president. Trump gave a speech at the United Nations devoted entirely, well, not entirely, but primarily to this question of national sovereignty. And it's really a fantastic speech. And you can read, if you just Google Trump at UN on national sovereignty, you can pull up the transcript of the speech. But that he made the point exactly that you just made. What he is proposing is not some chauvinistic America number one. What he was saying was that we're going to make America great again. And we think that every other sovereign nation in the world should make their own nations great again. And that was Trump's outlook. And it's really a remarkable and a great thing that this was the approach he took. I mean, people should remember that there were no wars under Trump for 4 years. Right. He was not interested in attacking other countries. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, this is what makes him a big threat to the British, right? To the British Empire.
Yeah, absolutely.
The globalists, whatever anybody wants to call them. Although I think they should get more educated as to that it is actually a British financial empire.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the sort of overall policy you could group under the term globalization, and people talk about the globalists, but there's nothing really wrong with that, except it's not precise enough. Because if you just talk about some loose amalgamation of globalists, then you don't really understand what's going on. You think, well, it's just a bunch of rich people trying to get richer. And sure, there's plenty of them. But you have to understand it from the fact that there is a strategic intention to destroy the United States of America. And that strategic intention does not come from some loose group of globalists. It comes from the British Empire. And that we have an enemy in the world. You can't win a war if you don't know who your enemy is. And people today have to learn what the historic enemy of the United States has been. I mean, we've fought a lot of wars in American history. Well, not as many as other countries, but we've had several wars. Mexican War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War. We fought many wars, or several wars, several of which we shouldn't have fought at all. But we've only had one power in the world intent on destroying our republic from the very beginning. And that's the British Empire. And almost no one today, I mean, maybe a small handful, but almost no one today actually knows that from 1775 until 1901, now that's 125 years. From 1775 to 1901, it was clearly understood by the overwhelming majority of Americans that the British Empire was the primary enemy of the United States. The primary enemy of the United States. This was understood in the 1840s, 1870s, 1890s, and it was only the assassination of McKinley that changed that. When you got Teddy Roosevelt, who loved the British Empire, and then you got Woodrow Wilson. And you have to really understand that these things are not just happening. They're not just wealthy globalists trying to weaken us or something, or make a lot of money. That there is an intention to destroy our republic. And it's not coming from China. People get into that. I wouldn't want to live in China. I don't want to live in a one-party state. I don't want to live in a country that locks their people in their houses and welds the doors shut during a COVID lockdown. I mean, who wants to live in a country like that? But the Chinese are primarily interested in their own self-interest, making money, strengthening their country, building up their economy. They're interested in their own self-interest. And you can understand that they are our competitors and that it is a fierce competition. And sometimes you can make deals, sometimes it's difficult to make deals. This was Donald Trump's approach to China, as it was with Mexico, as it was with Canada, as it was with North Korea. It is not China who led the effort to impeach Donald Trump, to drive Trump from office, to keep him off the ballot right now, to put him in prison. That's not coming from China. It's coming from the British, as conduited through the CIA, the FBI, the major news media, all of these British allied conduits. People just need to think this through. You can't just have knee-jerk reactions to things. You need to think. You need to investigate. You need to recognize that maybe there are certain things that you didn't know that you need to learn. Because as you grow older, you should recognize that you can continue to learn and develop your understanding of history, of economics, of what's going on in the world. It's always a bad idea to sort of stop at a certain point with fixed views and say, okay, now I know everything. Now no one can tell me anything. That's a very foolish attitude to take in life. You have to have an open mind about things.
Absolutely. And the British Empire, which is the happening financial empire right now, relies on people having those fixed ideas because it's going to be everything's unbelievable.
Right.
And these guys not only control the finances, they control the media and so on. So they're able to get people to believe something, and people want to grab onto something, not have to think about it anymore. So they've got it made in that respect. Now, and by the way, before I go on to my next thing, what you just described there, the British have been very good at hiding, because people of the world, people of the United States are thinking, Russia's the enemy, China's the enemy, when the real enemy, who's manipulating everybody against each other, is just sitting back behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Undisturbed. And that is what's going on. We need to lift the curtain, and the way to do it is read things like your dossier. And also, for example, one of the many books you've written is The Modern Anglo-Dutch Empire, which really goes into depth on this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
One very important thing that holds true here is the British financial empire is very serious about this, retaining their control on things. Noted by, and these quotes are available in writing, for example, the House of Lords determined that we cannot stand another term of Trump. This is back before the 2020 election. And look at what happened. Look at the lengths they went through. I mean, with the COVID and the riots and you name it, believe me, they were pulling the strings. And I know you know that, but I don't know if all our viewers know that. But of course, the viewers of this show probably are very aware of that. But they are extremely serious about this, which brings us back to the threat of Trump. He's a very big threat to them. He's standing in their way. They cannot stand another term of him, and they'll do anything to stop him, which brings us back to a possible assassination. So can you just shed a little light on kind of a parallel between what's occurred with the past assassinations to what's going on now? What are the signs that are leading up to something that's happened before with Lincoln and McKinley and Kennedy? Can you do that? Show some sort of a parallel here so we can kind of forecast things and be prepared and do something about it?
Well, I don't know if I can give a parallel. I mean, you mentioned the House of Lords report. I'll just, for people who are not aware of it, I think it was 2018. I forget the exact year. A special commission of the House of Lords in London, a special committee appointed by the House of Lords, came over to the United States and visited Washington, D.C., where they met with members of Congress, people in the intelligence community, people in some of the Washington, D.C.-based think tanks, these kind of things. And they went back to London, and then they authored and published the House of Lords report based on this visit they had made to Washington. And it was in that report where they stated that we can live with the consequences of one term of Trump in the White House. We may not like what he's doing. We may suffer some bad consequences of what he's doing, but we can manage to make it through one term. But that we must not have a second term. Under no circumstances should there be a second Trump presidency. So that was the British House of Lords. And you're right after that, we got COVID, we got George Floyd, we got the BLM riots, we got the vote fraud in the election. We got all these things. We got the two impeachments of Trump. So that was that. As to historical parallels, I don't know if I can really make them. You can look at, and I go through this in the police dossier, but the British proxy war in 1861 to 65 against the United States, as everyone knows, failed. The Confederacy was defeated. The Union was preserved. And Lincoln at that point was just beginning. He was only, I think, 1 month into his second term. So he had a full 4 more years in the White House, only this time with a unified nation. And during the Civil War, the Union had built up enormous manufacturing, technological, and scientific capabilities. By 1865, the United States was the leading manufacturing and technological nation in the world, far surpassed the British Empire. It was the greatest industrial power in the world in human history. And so this was the nation which was emerging out of the Civil War, and Lincoln was going to be president for the next 4 years. For the British, this was a real threat. In fact, during the Civil War, there were a number of people who were advising Lincoln to declare war on Great Britain because the British were behind the Confederacy. One of the most insistent of these was his Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward had lobbied Lincoln, literally gone to Lincoln over and over again, urging Lincoln to declare war on Great Britain. Lincoln wouldn't do it. There's a funny story that one of these occasions, when Seward told Lincoln, now's the time to declare war on England, allegedly Lincoln said, listen, Mr. Seward, let's take it one war at a time.
Yeah.
You don't know what would have happened, but the British perceived Lincoln with a nation that's reunified, that has industrial and scientific capabilities that far outstrip the British Empire, that they could not allow Lincoln a second term. And then you fast forward to McKinley, and McKinley's policy was explicitly anti-colonial, anti-imperial. He really did support this idea, and that not just support it. This was his whole philosophy of foreign policy, of cooperation among sovereign nations for economic development. He actually had a term for it, which he called reciprocity, that our relations with other nations are going to be governed by the principle of reciprocity. And of course, McKinley was also the big supporter of tariffs to build up American manufacturing, American technology and science. And McKinley, what he was putting forward from the United States in 1901 was a direct challenge to how the British Empire ran its business, how it ran the world. And he had to go. And then I'm not going to go into Kennedy in any depth, but I just point out one thing. And I'm not even saying it's the most important thing. But bear in mind that in mid to late 1963, Kennedy had signed 2 executive orders to begin withdrawing U.S. forces, special advisors and others, and whatever troops we had there, to begin withdrawing U.S. forces from Vietnam. And he had made it very clear, explicit, that his intention was within a matter of 3 to 6 months to withdraw all U.S. military personnel from Vietnam. That's what he was going to do. And that's not guesswork. He signed these executive orders. The troops actually, even before he was assassinated, the first of these of American advisors and forces were already being withdrawn. more withdrawals were scheduled. He told people around him, and they've written about this, people who were in on these meetings, that he was going to withdraw all of our forces from Vietnam. And he gets assassinated. And within days,
Right.
Johnson signs an order countermanding this. And within a year, we're plunged into the war in Vietnam, which lasted 10 years, and the effects of which we've never recovered from.
Right.
And of course, our closest ally, military and strategic ally in the war in Vietnam was Great Britain. Those are some of the consequences of these things.
Right. So it's very obvious these people, for example, they could not stand another term of Lincoln, so they killed him. They couldn't handle McKinley progressing in what he was doing, or Kennedy, so they killed him. They've made it very clear they cannot handle another term of Trump, and they've tried everything in the book.
Yeah.
So it's kind of obvious what could be coming next. So we're kind of at the end here, but
all right.
What I wanted to ask you was, what's the solution here? What do we do about this?
Well, I don't have a pat answer, but I would point to two things. One is that the police dossier, which is, as I said, available for download on the LaRouche PAC website, which people can print out and circulate, or people can, in PDF format, email it widely and post it widely everywhere that they can. That dossier is available. And in terms of the deadly threat that now exists against Donald Trump, the circulation of this dossier is, I think, of great importance. So that's number one. And then secondly, in terms of what we can do, what people can do, is everyone who is listening to this or watching this, and all of your friends and people you talk to, get more active than you are. Get your friends more active than they are. We are in the battle of our lifetimes. Between now and November, we have to ensure the re-election of Donald Trump, and we have to get him back into the White House in 2025. That's our task. That's our mission, if we have any hope at all of turning this situation around. So that's what I would say.
Okay, good. Very good. And of course, it's endless how they could get involved. There's many, many ways.
Many ways.
Right. One, which is what we're talking about today, is study this dossier, learn it, and spread it around. And of course, then there's poll watching, and it's just numerous, the ways there are to help. And just pick one. And pick one that suits your time or whatever, or doesn't suit your time, and you're going to have to make it go right a little bit here. But okay, good. So I really thank you for filling us in on all this. And again, they can go to larochepac.com to get this dossier and to read it, print it, send it around, email it, what have you. And that's pretty much it as far as a call to action right now. Study it, learn it, and when I do my outro here, I'll leave contact information for me and my website, and I'll again leave LaRouche PAC's website and so on, so people can email me directly to ask questions, and I can get answers from you and whoever, but we're there for you. I think that's pretty much it. Thank you so much, Bob, for filling us all in. I'm sure for many, this is going to be the first time they've heard most of this.
Well, thank you, Scott. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Sure thing. Anytime. All right, then. You have a good rest of your day, Bob, and we'll be talking.
Okay.
Well, there you have it, everybody. I hope you heard some things which you do not hear on the mainstream or corporate media, but need to hear and actually spread around in order to help save this nation and the man who can lead us back to the sovereign nation our forefathers intended. Remember, it's a global financial empire, the modern British Empire, that's behind the endless wars, the Green New Deal, the divisiveness, the reduction of energy production, you name it, in order for them to maintain control. Well, they are about to lose it with Donald Trump standing in their way, and they can't stand that. Lincoln beat them in the proxy war they had with our country we call the Civil War. He created a unified country and the greatest industrial power in the world. This was a threat to that very same empire, so they shot him. McKinley was totally anti-colonial and anti-imperial and was rallying the cooperation of the sovereign nations of the world against the British Empire, so they had him shot. Kennedy ordered the withdrawal from Vietnam, which would put an end to the endless war the British Empire was creating, as well as a threat to their Federal Reserve, which they used to manipulate and control our country, so they had him shot. And Trump, in his first presidency, brokered peace deals like the Abraham Accord, maintained communication and cooperation with China, Russia, North Korea, and the major powers of the world. He closed the border, created a better economy, and was on his way to bigger and better things. But they defrauded him out of the 2020 election, put their pawn in the White House, and now look at where we are. And now he's coming back for a second term, with a movement behind him bigger and better than before. And as the House of Lords stated, we could handle one term of Trump, but we cannot stand another if we are to survive. And therefore, they impeached him twice, indicted him 4 times, slandered him in the media, and much more. And he keeps coming back stronger and stronger. So what else is there for them to do but to handle things the way they did with Lincoln, McKinley, and JFK? Read the police dossier and see how they did what they did in the past regarding the assassinations of our best presidents, and learn more about who they are, so you will have a better idea as to how you can help, or at least spread it around so the nation becomes stronger with knowledge of their enemies. You can find the police dossier at larochepack.com. You can go there directly or find them at my site, takecontrolofyourliberty.com, where you can also subscribe. I'll leave the web addresses in my show notes. I thank you all for your time, and God bless America.